Today's reading will be found in John chapter 19, verses 17 through to 27. John 19, 17 through 27. Carrying his own cross, he went down to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on each side and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." Many Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priest of the Jews protested to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be the King of the Jews." Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarment remaining. This garment was seamless, woven in one piece, from top to bottom. "Let's not tear it," they said to one another. "Let's decide by lot who will get it." This happened that the scripture might be fulfilled that said, "They divided my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment." This is what the soldiers did. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother standing there, and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son," and to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that time on, this disciple took her into his home.
It's always interesting when we come to a time like Mother's Day or Father's Day and we see a society that offers a certain amount of honor to these roles, to these people. And yet we also recognize that for many people, their mother or their father may not have been the classic image that we want. You know, there are parents who are abusive, aren't there? There are parents who are hurtful. There are parents who are simply biological functions and that have been totally absent, and just not everybody can quite enjoy the same mental image or picture. That's why I think maybe it's appropriate for us to focus our thought on the idea of what might be more the ideal, to think in terms of love. And it's important for us. I mean, the reality is we see motherhood in a very natural way. I don't know if you saw the little video on Facebook this past week, but a little girl managed to get too close to a baby goose. And you can imagine what Mama Goose did. It was just a bunch of wings and beak for that little girl, and she was just absolutely terrified of what this mother did to protect her baby. I always think of something that I saw when I was young. We were traveling with Mom, Dad, me, and we were in Yellowstone National Park. And, you know, as you go through the park, you always have that time where, you know, somewhere you're going to find a group of bears, you know, walking along and getting very close to the road. And, of course, there will be all these cars that are stopped there. And one of the things they tell you is if you see a bear, do not get out of your car. I mean, that only makes sense, doesn't it? You're this big, bear's this big. Your hand's this big, bear's claws are like that. You know, just don't get out of your car. Well, this one genius decided he wanted to get out of his car and take a picture of 2 cute little bear cubs. And he got into the way. He got between Mama Bear and the cubs. He narrowly escaped with his life. You know, Mama Bear just kind of, you know, her sense and need to protect just launched right out. And so our first lesson could be very simple. Don't mess with Mama's cubs. And some of the moms are kind of nodding at me, just don't mess with my kids. But what I want to do is I want us to take a look at this story and to think about it, because it offers for us some things about what love will do. And I think as you might consider the wording here, I thought about what love might do. And yet, as I look at the real examples of love, and as I look at this story here, I think that we can pretty well assume that love, real love, is going to do certain things under certain situations. Now, the story is kind of a general story, in fact, looking at what I would call the way to the cross. That there's some things here about Jesus being taken to the cross. He's taken to this place called the place of the skull. We remember it by the term Golgotha, which John mentions. And there's the disagreement about what Pilate should put on the sign. Jesus, King of the Jews, and the Jewish leaders don't want that. They want that Jesus claimed to be. And Pilate says, well, what I've written, I have written. And the guards casting lots, splitting up his clothing. And interestingly, fulfilling the prophecy there, back from the Old Testament. And then Jesus on the cross looking down and seeing his mother and her sister, Mary the wife of Clopas and Mary Magdalene. But as Jesus looks down from the cross and sees them, he has one last bit of business that he wants to do. He sees his mother. Now, the thing to think about is that the gospel accounts tell us that Jesus was not the only son. He had other brothers and sisters. There were people that he could have left this responsibility to. But he looks down and he sees John. And John refers to himself in this gospel as the writer, as the disciple whom Jesus loved. That always intrigues me. I mean, there's the one side of me that I think about, you have a family, you have multiple children, and you got one that somehow is labeled that, this is the one that dad or mom really loved. Kind of like, well, what are the others? Chopped liver? You know that a parent loves all their children. You know that Jesus loved all of his disciples. But somehow John gets honored by this designation. And it may be that since John is giving this to himself, that what he's thinking about here more is that rather than mentioning himself by name, he uses this reference to himself. But it seems like John has a very special relationship with Jesus, and I think it's really appropriate that John is the one that tells us about this very loving situation that's going on here. And so it says that he looked down, he saw his mother, and he saw John standing nearby. Now, doesn't sound like John's right next to her, but close enough for Jesus to look at both of them as he talks. And he says, "Dear woman, here's your son." He's not referring to himself by doing that. And I think quite likely that as he's saying that, he's looking over at John. And then says to John, "Here's your mother." He's not entrusting her to other members of the family, but rather he sees that John is the person that he wants to make responsible for love and care. And the next statement that John makes here in the account is that from that time on, this disciple took her into his home. He now treats her as part of the family. And given the relationship he has with Jesus, would bestow a very special honor on her. As you think about the idea of the different events in this story and think about what love will do, there are many different emotions and feelings and even actions that we call love. You know, there's that really mushy kind of thing. And with our kids, it was always kind of cute that, the kids would wrap their arms around your neck and start to squeeze. And Mommy or Daddy, I love you this much. And Mommy or Daddy at some point has to say, yeah, I love you. I love you too, but I need to breathe. Because somehow that expression of love becomes, life-threatening. But the expression of affection and of closeness and of intimacy becomes very important, doesn't it? But sometimes doesn't love appear selfish? Doesn't it kind of come across as, well, you're mine? In other words, it becomes possessive, becoming uncomfortable for the object of the love. And you realize, well, that may not necessarily be what love really means. It's a very special action. And when the Bible uses the word love, there are different kinds of love. We're not going to get into all of those. But one in particular, that word agape, is an action, not a feeling. Ironically, it is the word that is used to refer to John as the disciple whom Jesus loved. But as an expression of genuine concern and action toward a person that is the object of that love, I think this story, this account, points out some special things. Paul, in 1 Corinthians 13, in the great love chapter, sums up love with the idea that love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. That love is something that is going to be ever present, even in the face of overwhelming circumstances. Love is going to be there when it's hard for it to be there. And when many things about the situation would say, don't be there. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. But Paul then goes on to say, love never ends. It never fails. And he's talking about this agape. And so you think about John when he writes in John 3:16, God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that it's in the face of all of the reasons for God not to love the world, isn't it? It's in the face of our sin and our rebellion and our willfulness and our disobedience. And so it tells us that love is not this cute, cuddly little thing. It's God doing what really we needed, even if there's a real price to pay. So I want to just point out a few things here about what love will do. And maybe start with the story here at the end of the story, where John opens his heart and his home to look after Mary from that point on. We see it kind of as an adoptive relationship. There are other members of the family. And John doesn't say, well, Jesus, there's James and there's Jude and there's all these others. Why don't you let them look after her? But yet John's got a heart there that says Mary's going to need somebody to give her the special love and attention and regard. Mary's paid, through the whole story and life of Jesus, Mary has paid an amazing price to be his mother. And so he's ready to open his heart and his home toward her. And you know what? I don't have a doubt in the world that his heart was already open toward her. One of the things about this story that I find interesting. All right, we have the story the night before of Jesus after the upper room going across the Kidron Valley to the garden, Gethsemane. And he's praying there when the soldiers arrive and come to arrest him. And after a bit of dialogue, conversation, argument, whatever you want to call it, between some of the apostles and the temple guard, that when they actually start to arrest Jesus, Peter takes the sword and swings it and knocks off the ear of the high priest Malchus, of the high priest's servant Malchus. But it isn't very long before the apostles disappear as Jesus is arrested and dragged off to be tried. There are a few who lurk around the home and the courtyard where Jesus is being held and tried. But even then, you got Peter's denial. I never knew him. When the heat, Jesus used the saying, strike the shepherd and scatter the sheep. Well, that's exactly what happened. As soon as trouble came, those who were closest to him disappeared. And you'd think that this largely the fear of association and possibly sharing the same consequence. Arrest, and at that point they don't know that it's going to be death, but it's not looking good, is it? So, when Jesus is being crucified, there are 4 women, and John is standing nearby. Whatever the risk might be, that Mary would be there at the foot of the cross, don't you? And she's got her sister, and Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. You have these women who've been part of Jesus' life and his ministry. And maybe they have been more the heart of his ministry than the other apostles. And so whatever the risk of association with this criminal that's being executed from the Roman perspective, they're not afraid, they're not ashamed to be there with him and to be identified with him. Do you ever stop to think about if you're one of the apostles and you're there at that scene, would you maybe be at the back of the crowd, kind of anonymous? A horrid fascination with what's going on, but not really wanting somebody to say, hey, you're one of his disciples, let's put you up here too. No, thank you for that. See, love, and even for John, for all the things we might say somewhat critically of the apostles, and for what John may have not done the night before with the arrest and all that, John's there. And he's near the women at the foot of the cross. Love takes risks. He's not thinking about what the outcome might be for him, or what the consequence might be. He's got a relationship with Jesus. He loves him. And he knows that he wants to be there. The scene of a crucifixion was not a pleasant one. Everything that I've read about the Roman practice of crucifixion, and there are other cultures who use something similar, was that it was to be the type of event that would act to discourage other people from doing things that the Romans considered to be rebellious and criminal. To have a public execution that was painful, bloody, would be a major deterrent. And while there were people there that were kind of, religious leaders that were kind of celebrating the event because they were finally getting rid of this person who's been embarrassing them, that the crowds that followed Jesus seemed not to be quite as involved in this event. Crucifixion was messy. It was violent. It's almost like, in today's society, there would have been a notice up there, warning. The event you're about to see might be damaging psychologically because of its violence and its gore. Sometimes you hear people say, oh, I don't want to go see that or do that. It's going to be messy and I don't want, Sometimes people say, I don't want to go into the hospital. But for Mary and the other women and for John, their love for Jesus overcame any reluctance or hesitance or fear that the gore and the mess might create. You remember when the movie, The Passion of Christ, came out several years ago. And one of the things about that movie is when you watched it, there were some horrific scenes of gore and violence there. And I will say that I think there might have been a scene or two that exploited that. But yet at the same time, it was not the sanitized image sometimes I think we have when we come to the Lord's Supper. I mean, we're in this beautiful room and we have these nice trays, and Jesus' death was messy. It was horrific. But because of love, these women and John were there. And their love overcame any natural reluctance or reticence that might have been there. Love stands with the pain. As I'm thinking about this, I can't help but think about mothers and parents. Fathers got to get credit with this. I mean, parents share some of the worst moments of their children, don't we? When our kids are sick, throwing up, having diarrhea, when they fall and hurt themselves and they're bleeding. It's mom and dad that are there to look after them. You don't see a parent going, oh, that's messy, I don't want to get involved. We get right in there, don't we? Why? Because of love. Love stands with the pain. And even if they couldn't be up with Jesus on the cross or have any way of alleviating it or easing it, just the fact they're present is powerful. Could you imagine if Jesus had gone through the cross and there was nobody there with him? None of his disciples? None of the people that he spent the last 3 years with? None of the women that were an important part of his ministry, and some of the women were the ones that were providing financial support for him. Imagine if he had just died in that shame that first century Jewish culture looked at with crucifixion. And there's nobody. One of the things that sometimes I think we feel like is that when we know that somebody is dying, that we don't want them to die alone. Love stands with the pain. They were there with Jesus. But then the ultimate idea here is that love gives up self. The reason Jesus is dying on the cross, and he knows it, is because he is dying for the sins of the world. That he's offering himself for them, for us. He's paying a price for sin. His prayer, Father, I pray that you let this cup pass from me, but not my will, your will be done. I lay down my life for my sheep. You and I, as Christians, are his sheep. If you're not a Christian, then that's always one of the things that we want to encourage you to think about is to become one of those people who benefit from what Jesus did here. That he was thinking not about himself. He's not up there having a pity party, oh, poor me. He's thinking, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They don't realize that they're crucifying the Son of God. Love does many strange, selfless, powerful things. People don't stop when they are motivated by love. They don't stop to think about what the consequences might be or what the price might be. They think about the need and the hurt and how they can help. Love will do many things. And as God's people, we need to be people of love. Tim's chosen a song for us to close with about love. And as we're singing this song, I encourage you to be thinking about the role of love and place of love in your life. Let's stand as we sing.